It's beautiful.
The first Space Marine game from back in 2011 really was the kind of thing that could turn someone into a 40k fan. And I say that from experience, considering prior to playing it, I really didn't care all that much about the franchise. I mean, I'd played Space Hulk on my PS1 and Fire Warrior on my PS2 before that, but this was the first time I fully understood why people were so encapsulated with this series and all its lore. Especially the way it portrayed the overwhelming legions of orcs and the steadfast and no-nonsense approach the Ultramarines had when they dealt with them the only way they could.
Space Marine!
As anyone who's played that original game can probably tell you, one of its biggest shortcomings was that it ended on a seriously nail-biting cliffhanger, leaving the future of our boy Titus undetermined and, to be honest, not looking all that bright either. Well, finally now, in 2024, we can get some long-awaited answers because the sequel, Space Marine 2, is finally here, developed by Saber Interactive.
What is your pledge?
My pledge is eternal service.
And it follows much in the same vein as its predecessor, focusing on lots of stomping around in a big blue suit of armor, and being responsible for a serious decline in the population of heretical scum throughout the galaxy. The whole thing opens from the perspective of a Death Watch Marine, sent to the planet of Kadaku when it's under attack by a sudden infestation of Tyranids. After a truly epic and badass opening cinematic, this mysterious Marine falls from his dropship, and then has to try to hook up back with his squad and detonate a bomb to wipe out the Xenos in the area. Then the next 15 or 20 minutes of this prologue mission really just serves as a bit of a tutorial for all of the controls and the mechanics, along with setting up the whole story. And look, I'm not really going to spoil what else happens during this prologue, but the main takeaway from this whole opening sequence is that our boy Titus is back, and reinstated as an Ultramarine, brought in to investigate the reasons for this Tyranid invasion, and more importantly, to stop it.
You will take your place as an Ultramarine once more. Yeah!
And he's brought back in to investigate the reasons for this invasion, and more importantly, to try to stop it. Eventually, the story does get back to why he was accused in the first game, but a lot of the cinematics here are really just Titus being given his next objective, along with scenes where he's bickering back and forth with one of the new Marines in his squad named Gadriel, a guy who doesn't trust him for various reasons and also ain't shy about bringing that up every 5 minutes. Yeah, like how this dude hasn't got the sack at this point is anyone's guess.
What were you accused of?
Corruption.
Which is kind of funny as well, considering the other squad member named Chiron just kind of soldiers on the entire time like an absolute lad.
You're right.
But it is quite a bit of a running theme that they've got going here, and that's how Titus is constantly being accused or under suspicion for his actions and things he's done or said in the past. And yeah, like I can't imagine what that's got to be like, you know, having everyone constantly criticize you over something you did in the past.
Prove yourself to us.
Anyway, all up, there's 6 missions in the campaign, all of which can be finished in around 45 or so minutes, save for the final mission, which for some reason is like 2 hours long. Why they didn't just split that one up into multiple parts as well is anyone's guess. And about the only thing that disappoints me there is that they didn't bring back Mark Strong to voice Titus.
There's a strategy behind it.
I don't know, I guess Mark Strong was too busy doing nothing. Either way, it's a decent enough story, and gives enough of a reason to have you in all these various scenarios. We can witness these events of total annihilation as both the Tyranids and the Imperium of Man get into these humongous battles. And eventually, even the Thousand Sons Marines show up as well, you know, if that wasn't enough. Sadly though, there's no orcs.
Get off my ship, Space Marine! I'm Boss Grimskull!
I love that little guy.
In case you haven't really noticed yet either, it probably goes without saying that this is one seriously good looking game. And one that also seems to be pretty well optimized, thanks in no part I'm sure to the fact that it doesn't use de novo. The environments are all detailed, striking and vivid, and there's a lot of great moments here when you can look off into the distance and just see that never-ending swarm of Tyranids running across the horizon.
Keep your heads and get it done.
There's a great sense of scale to some of these set pieces as well, with explosions going off, tanks and other vehicles moving about, along with seeing those poor droves of foot soldiers marching off to certain death. and even walking past these guys, you'll see them bowing in respect. Really just makes you feel like you're smack bang in the middle of these giant conflicts, which is in stark contrast to how linear the missions actually are, with there really not being all that much exploration or side content to see. You pretty much just move from one area to the next, killing what's ever dumb enough to get in your way, then proceeding to the next area and just doing it again. All of the various executions here are suitably gory as well, with all the characters even having their shiny blue armor covered in the bodily fluids of whatever they've just eviscerated.
They never learn.
And I really like too with the executions against the Thousand Suns Marines, how your character's just going to rip their head off entirely, letting all that chaos energy spill out of that gaping neck hole. Now, during cinematics, the facial animations can come across as a bit basic, but then you've also got to keep in mind that these aren't people that are brimming with excitement or positive vibes. I mean, it's a bunch of people here who are more or less forced into an existence of nothing but servitude, and their current predicament involves them trying to avoid being horribly killed by millions and millions of super pissed off space spiders. Along with the fact as well that a lot of these soldiers are Cadian, which probably means they've seen and done it all by this point.
Yes, my lord. Follow me.
Either way though, in terms of the presentation, like, a lot of this stuff just reeks of being wet dream material, and it's pretty damn clear that Saber Interactive have got a lot of love for that source material. Just a bit of a shame though that there's not any kind of codex or bestiary for the player to read through. I mean, at no point is there any kind of menu screen that's got a detailed list of all the enemy types, the factions, weapons, characters, and all that kind of stuff. Which really kind of seems like a bit of an oversight for a game like this. You know, a 40k game of all things, based off a franchise that absolutely thrives on its painstaking lore. As for the gameplay, well, that's broken down primarily into 3 modes. You got the story mode in the campaign, the operations PvE mode, and then the multiplayer PvP, which sadly wasn't available before launch for me to play.
Hello?
Regardless of which mode you're playing though, Space Marine 2 feels like a combination of a bunch of other titles all rolled into one. I mean, for starters, like, it obviously feels like the first game in the most basic sense, where you're lumbering around in your power armor, combining melee combat with ranged weapons depending on the situation. In the PvE mode, the vast majority of enemies are the swarms of Tyranids, droves of the weaker fodder types that can be killed in a single melee hit or with a couple of rounds from your bolter. And much like the first game, you'll just carve a path through these things without much drama, making it feel very much like other Horde shooters we've had in recent memory, with Darktide being a pretty notable example, along with, of course, World War Z, which is made by the same devs. Also, like the first game, you'll come up against these tougher variants, who are more resistant to your weapons. And this is where it almost becomes kinda Souls-like, if I can say that, where you can now choose to lock onto that one enemy, then focusing on the melee combat, where you've got to either dodge or parry these highly telegraphed attacks, because every single third-person game these days has to have a variant of this fucking mechanic. Yes, the kind of thing you've seen 100 times before now, where you wait until the last nanosecond to parry or dodge, which then leaves that enemy wide open to a free counterattack. But still, like, you're gonna have to genuinely come to grips with this system. Because if you don't, well, then these tougher enemies are gonna reach right through that pretty blue armor and tear you a new shit pipe. But it's also important as well because successful dodges and parries are one of the main ways to stay on your feet. The way that health and armor works is again like the first game, where you've got an armor bar that regenerates over time, but then your health can only be replenished through healing stims or Titus's unique skill, where it goes into this kind of berserk mode and gets a bit of it back. But the thing is that this skill is unique to Titus, and those healing stims are about as rare as photos of your mum with her clothes on, which means instead you're gonna have to keep your armor topped up, which is done through executions and gun strikes. You still with me at this point? Now, the executions are basically what it sounds like. They're finishing moves against the tougher enemies where you find the most creative way to remove them from the gene pool, which in the process restores about 1 or 2 armor bars. I mean, it's basically a glory kill. Oh yeah, and luckily too, you've got that magical ability that the Doomslayer has of being completely immune to all damage during these animations.
Another one dead.
The gun strikes, on the other hand, are like this attack you can pull off quickly after knocking a weaker enemy on their ass, or by parrying one of the tougher ones at just the right time, and again, usually restores like 1 or 2 armor points. And all of this is fine in principle, the only problem is that sometimes you accidentally pulverize an enemy instead of knocking them over, which means you can't really consistently pull this off. And then the parrying and dodging windows don't always seem to be consistent against those bigger enemies either. Not to mention, for some attacks, it seems you can't even parry them to begin with. The only time it becomes pretty much mandatory is during the boss fights, because almost all of their attacks here are dependent on using this system. Oh yeah, and also too, if like you're playing in co-op, it can actually become a bit of a scramble, as everyone's trying to execute enemies to get their own armor back. It's kind of like playing Doom Eternal with 2 other Slayers running around, and everyone having to share all the glory kills. And what I think they're really trying to go for here is that once you essentially master dodging and parrying, that you won't really have to worry about taking any damage to begin with. The problem is that completely goes to shit in the more opened up areas, where you've got no real defense for avoiding the half dozen or so assholes that are off in the background shooting at you with ranged fucking weapons. Just really forcing you to take a big old bite out of a colossally large shit sandwich. This is actually something that happened quite a bit in the original game, and I don't know, like maybe they've done this on purpose as sort of a throwback to a bygone era or something. But either way though, like it definitely reminded me a lot of how you just get absolutely shredded if you don't focus on those ranged guys first and foremost. All up though, like it definitely makes the whole thing more skill-based in the first game. You know, considering in the first game, you basically had no real means of defense outside of just rolling around.
Fuck this shit! No fear!
And that feeling you get from a perfect parry, catching a leaping Tyranid in midair before slamming it down into the ground, really never does get old.
Got your ass.
Along with the feeling of shooting what's basically a rapid-fire rocket launcher at your enemies. Oh yeah, speaking of as well, the weapons here are pretty much your standard 40k fare, with both a main and a sidearm available along with a melee weapon. There's all those different variants of the bolters and pistols, along with the chainsword, hammer, and the power sword. The latter of which I found to be one of the best weapons in the game. There's also bigger weapons out there as well, like the heavy bolter, which turns you into a slowly moving tank whenever you're aiming it. Along with my personal favourite, the melter rifle. Oh yeah, let me do you a favour as well and just say, as soon as you unlock this thing, you need to have it in your arsenal at all times. I mean, look, like nothing beats a good bolter by your side, but the melter rifle in this is more or less just easy mode, able to shred through groups of enemies in only a few shots, which is pretty damn important considering the kind of enemy count you're coming up against here. Because like I mentioned before, this really is an outright horde shooter now, where you're attacked by very large groups of enemies at once, who can even climb up the walls like it's World War Z. In fact, a lot of the missions have these moments where your objective is to just survive and push back these constant swarms of enemies. You know, the kind of thing that's really just blue screen of death bait for people with weaker computers. And yeah, like I know that the first game had a pretty high enemy count, but it was absolutely nothing like this, even at the best of times. And it sure didn't have enemies literally climbing over one another to try to reach the player. One mission has you having to fight back against not only Tyranids, but also what looks like a bazillion or so Rippers as well. Those little assholes scurrying all over the ground and looking like they're breaking every single rule in the Matrix.
Rippers, here they come. Ranged weapons only.
So it's easily double, if not triple, the kind of numbers we got in that first game. That's a good thing. It's even got those similar mechanics where you've got to assemble up with the other two characters before you can move on to the next area, along with everyone having to share grenade, health and ammo pickups along the way. If a player's knocked down, they can be revived a couple of times before they're finally killed and have to wait to respawn back in. And the sheer volume of things to kill here really does feel overwhelming at times. And that's the thing, is that this really doesn't feel like a single player campaign in the traditional sense. I mean, especially compared to how it was in the first game. It really just feels like a co-op campaign that you can play through solo, and it's clearly been designed around playing with other people. I mean, even in the campaign mode, you've got that loading screen that shows the Marines sitting idly in the dropship, which, you know, again is kind of like Darktide, and really just put there so players can see how their customized character looks. It's not this one continuously flowing overarching story anymore. Instead, what you do is you play through one mission. You complete your objectives before it then sends you back to the battle barge and you move on to do the next one. And because of this, like, I really wouldn't advise playing through this solo.
You're right.
Firstly, because the bot AI is more or less completely useless and can barely seem to carry their own weight. And then secondly, because it's just so boring going through these motions by yourself. I mean, the story beats are cool and some of the plot twists are fun and all that stuff, but the monotony of just killing the same 2 or 3 enemy types over and over when there's no one else there to shoot the shit with along the way just gets kind of old. The other thing is that even if you want to play this solo, it seems you still have to connect to the server, because you have to be online for the game to save you progress. I guess this has been done to stop people from cheating or modifying their character or something, which, yeah, I don't know, I guess that makes sense, but it is just still kinda crappy. And if any other big budget game did this same thing, you'd see people up in arms about it over on Twitter. But of course, you know, this is something you'll probably hear no one else mention.
Should it be discovered, there would be questions.
On a positive note though, you do get checkpoints throughout the missions, so if you fail them, it's not like you've got to start from scratch or anything like that. And with the exception of that final mission, all of these are well paced, taking about 45 minutes to get through. I will say as well that there's not really any point to playing on hard mode here, considering you gain pretty much nothing from it. Aside from bragging rights, I guess, for a fan base that perpetually smells like armpits. But look, like, having said all that, the campaign still definitely has its moments. The few times you do get to get a jump pack are pretty damn fun, and being able to launch yourself into the sky and then back down into the ground to pummel everything is a feeling that's just second to none. I mean, that stuff was easily a highlight of the first game, and yeah, I'm glad they brought it back here. Along with that too, when you do finally unlock the hammer, being able to wreak havoc with that thing is also great. The thing is though that all of the positives I mentioned in regards to the campaign can also be applied to the operations mode. Considering with that mode, you can also choose and customize your loadout a lot more. To the point that it really does feel like they've made this PvE mode first, and then just kind of decided to build Titus's story around it, which really makes the operations mode the real meat of the game. Now, this is the multiplayer-focused PvE component that's designed not only around playing with other people, but also has some actual progression. Because now, instead of just playing as one of those 3 main characters, you've got 6 completely different classes, all which have their own unique ability. The Heavy, for instance, can bring up a defensive shield that deflects ranged attacks. The Tactical class can scan the area, highlighting enemies, which increases damage against them. Whereas the shield-carrying Bulwark can drop down a banner that restores everyone's armor. And not only are these skills unique for every single class, but there's also an element of skill there to trying to use these at the best possible times, considering as well that this mode is actually kind of challenging. Enemy spawns seem to be much more RNG based this time, plus it's also got that whole randomization element where you'll sometimes be attacked mid-mission by one of the sub-boss kind of enemies, making each run entirely different. The levels themselves are based off the missions from the campaign taking place in the exact same environments, only mixed around a bit to show off events that coincided with what Titus and his boys were up to at the same time. Which means that again, there's only currently 6 of these in total, all of which you'll have already seen, and in fact, you have to have already seen them, considering that you can't play through these without first having unlocked them in the story mode. But compared to the campaign, I really didn't mind replaying these over and over. Because at least with this mode, you're constantly leveling up and unlocking new perks and upgrades. With the player cap being 25 for each class and every single level up bringing something new to mess around with. And even after finishing like a dozen or so missions with the Heavy alone, I was only around level 10. Once you level up a few times, you can then take on that next tier of difficulty. And just like Darktide, there's optional collectibles you can find throughout each mission that affect the amount of XP you're going to get at the end.
Yep, that's it.
Return this to the
That's the one.
The higher the difficulty, the tougher enemies are going to become and the lesser resources you get, so there is quite a bit of skill here to clear all these missions on each mode. And even on what's the so-called normal difficulty mode, the second one out of 4, it's kind of crazy how quickly things can go south and you can all be on the brink of a wipe.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
So as a result, like, this mode is way more fun and rewarding to play through. Again, of course, assuming you're playing with a couple of mates and not relegated to being stuck with the bots. Where again, these guys really do seem about as useless as a crucifix at a whorehouse. Another cool aspect of this mode is the amount of armor customization you got here as well, with all the various chapters you can buy with all the different colors, emblems and decals, able to be unlocked through the game's main currency. Just a bit of a shame that all the current missions are just rehashes of the campaign, but this is without a doubt where you're going to sink the most of your time, especially if you're not too concerned about the PvP mode. Either way though, the long and short of it is that Space Marine 2 largely delivers the goods, and there's a whole lot of fun to be had here.
You're goddamn right.
More so considering their plans for the upcoming battle passes and the DLC, where I'm sure we'll get a bunch of extra missions for the operations mode and probably a couple new classes along the way as well. So whether you want to blast your way through that campaign as Titus, blast through the PvE content with a couple of your bros, or blast other people in the face with a melter gun, Space Marine 2 really doesn't fail on any of those fronts. There are, of course, minor issues here and there, as is the case, I suppose, with every modern game these days, but this thing ran properly from start to finish and it didn't crash on me once. It looked good, it sounded good, and it felt good. And that's really about all we can hope for these days. And short of the developers saying something dumb on social media, or a particular balding middle-aged man who doesn't pay child support somehow digging up some meaningless dirt on the game's development, I think I'm actually allowed to say that I enjoyed this one without getting into trouble, all coming together in a game that lets me cut space spiders in half with a handheld chainsaw sword, so yeah, all the better.
They never learn.